Our past is filled up with mysteries. Every time we find things being actually older than we thought, we realize how much is yet to discover. Carbon dating is an amazing tool to guide us, which is the way that we can know how old things are, but we can't expect it to give us an exact year. The first temple and first big settlements in history that we know of, Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, were founded around 10,000 to 9500 BCE, and that was the start of the pre-pottery Neolithic A, since the period is divided in A, B and C. In general, it marks the start of the domestication of cattle and the widespread of cultivation in the Middle East, which is known as the Neolithic Revolution. Bear in mind that at this time, this area was more fertile than now, because the last ice age was technically still going on. In this period, two settlements stand out. The first one is Tel Caramel, that's an appetizing name, inhabited from 10,650 to 9650 BCE in the north of Syria. This period coincides with the Younger Dryas, a period of climate change that suddenly made the northern hemisphere colder and less fertile, including the Levant, making it harder to have permanent settlements. This site had history's first stone towers, 5 of them. Some of the inhabitants had teeth with wear and carries, a sign of the consumption of carbohydrates from grains, and many had their heads intentionally removed, showing the earliest signs of a degree of adoration towards skulls, a head cult. 3 modified skulls were found in Göbekli Tepe as well, suggesting they also had that kind of cult. The other one is near the city of Jericho, northwest of the Sea of Galilee in the Levant, a site called Tel es Sultan. It was first occupied by the Natufian culture in the previous millennia, who were the first culture to make bread and brew beer. But after the Younger Dryas, it became a permanent settlement, which around 9000 BCE probably housed 2 to 3,000 people, giving it the honor of being the first town in history. They built circular stone houses that were about 5 meters wide, and that tower you can see in the center wasn't built until 1000 years later. Having been 8.5 meters tall, it inherited the title of the world's tallest building. It must have required hundreds of people to build it, suggesting the presence of social organization or even a hierarchy. Since the tower is in the very center of the town rather than outside, we don't really know what its purpose was. Maybe to protect salt or grain storages, or simply for the sake of showing off. A big tower like this might have been the greatest sign of status at the time. The start of the pre-pottery Neolithic B will be 8800 BCE, when we see the introduction of plastered skulls like the famous Jericho skull. The plastering seems like an attempt of immortalizing loved ones or important members of society by recreating their facial features with plaster, which was also a head cult. This will be done for the following millennia in many parts of the Middle East, from the southern Levant to Anatolia, suggesting a common culture and possibly a similar language. And our next protagonists are the people of Chayonu in eastern Anatolia. Founded in 8630 BCE, is considered to be the first proto-city. They were the first ones to use measurements for parallel foundations, to do leather working, the first textile piece of cloth, to domesticate pigs, and later sheep and goats, and the mining of copper, being way ahead of their time. They adopted rectangular buildings instead of circular. The purpose of this was to be able to build houses right next to each other, sharing walls and making all houses sturdier. As an honorary mention, the site of Nevali Shori, inhabited from 8400 to 8100 BCE, is strikingly similar to Chayonu and contained a section with a few stone pillars with animal paintings, some of them being T-shaped. And this big one, although broken, still has the same human features that an almost identical one from Göbekli Tepe had, with hands and a sort of belt. The site probably relates to the other ones in this period, so the T-shaped adoring culture might have endured for a good while. But all of these advancements so far, always closer to civilization, are impressive due to how old they are. In perspective, at this time 10,000 years ago, when it's considered that the last ice age finally ended and the sea levels were still rising from its glacial maximum 5,000 years prior, so landscapes like Doggerland were still higher than sea level, connecting France to Great Britain. France and Britain used to be part of the same land. I think that might be a fact that both countries will love to delete from their memory. Next up is what some call pre-pottery Neolithic C, from around 7800 BCE. We will start with Ein Ghazal, close to Jericho. Although it was populated since 8300 BCE, it was around 7000 BCE that it achieved a population of 3,000 people. 4 to 5 times the size of contemporary Jericho. It's actually more well known because of its statues, the first to be made with such detail and human size at the same time. It's 15 full-size ones and 15 busts, together with similar ones being done in Jericho at the time, which is a lot of art being performed very early. The societies of the time relied mostly on domesticated cattle and farming to survive, but they still benefited from a lot of hunting, which is implied by the dozens of statues of wild animals. These had the same purpose as animal paintings, but they are in 3D now, we're upgrading. And the greatest settlement of humanity until now is Çatalhöyük from southern Anatolia, inhabited from 7500 BCE. This has been famously called humanity's first city. But why? Because during its peak around 7000 BCE, it housed up to 10,000 people. The average modern town houses about 5,000, and anything higher than that could be considered as a small city. Ein Ghazal is considered by many to also be one of the first cities. Their houses were built together like a honeycomb or a maze, with no roads, relying on roof openings and ladders to get in and out. The rooftops served as their streets. There were no distinguishable public buildings, not even ritualistic ones. Instead, a part of their houses seemed to be dedicated to religious acts. The houses were scrupulously clean. They painted the insides with white plaster, and the bigger houses had art murals. The most mysterious aspect of their art is how they had this representation of a bear being very similar to one from Göbekli Tepe, in the same exact pose. And these representations of headless humans alongside birds, probably vultures, are similar to the ones found in pillars from Göbekli. That, alongside them having a head cult, implies that both cultures, over 3,000 years apart, might be linked. That is the same gap between the Bronze Age collapse in 1200 BCE and us. Both Ein Ghazal and Çatalhöyük, alongside Çayonu and many other settlements, practice some form of head cult, removing skulls and plastering or adorning them. Unfortunately, they all lost most of their population around 6500 BCE, this being the end of the pre-pottery Neolithic. The climate-changing event that caused this was the 8.2 kiloyear event. The sudden melting of glacial sheets in North America raised the sea levels, quickly changing temperatures all around the globe, making it overall cooler and drier. Now we move to, obviously, the pottery Neolithic, or late Neolithic, starting in 6500 BCE, and we're going to travel to Mesopotamia, which means lands between rivers, and that's the reason why we're going there. The rivers, Euphrates and Tigris, since the Levant and Anatolia lost a fair amount of their fertility, the areas next to these rivers will continue to allow people to survive on a sedentary farmer lifestyle. So the few who were able to migrate might have integrated the now rising cultures in the area, but our beloved T-shaped adoring culture will never be seen seeking a sedentary lifestyle again. Rest in hunter-gathering, my friends. These cultures were the Hassuna and Samara, who are responsible for the pottery in the name of this period. Now, there were basic forms of pottery being made as back as 29,000 BCE by the Gravitian culture in Czechia, the makers of this famous Venus figurine, and also being made by the Jomon in 10,500 BCE, who actually made pottery before becoming farmers, by the way. But these Mesopotamian populations were the first, adorning them with excellent skill, and the first major uses of it for cooking, storing food, transportation, you name it. Some of their settlements were built in more arid areas of Mesopotamia, and another culture would join them around 6100 BCE, the Halaf culture, between southeastern Anatolia and Mesopotamia, who would repopulate some settlements that were abandoned by the former two cultures. They also did pottery and were the first to do stamp seals. All of them seem to have been the first to use draft animals in farming and the earliest forms of plows. The first agrarian societies to reach Europe made the earliest site we know of in Albania around 6500 BCE, which slowly spread to the west, starting to do a fair amount of pottery 1000 years later. And the first North African farmers were those of Egypt in 6100 BCE, like in Napta Playa. But the ancestors of the Mesopotamian civilizations were the Ubaid from 5500 BCE, founding various settlements in the area, including Uruk and Ur, which will be very important later on. These people built elevated foundations into the swamps next to the rivers and were able to cultivate in these areas. With time, they also spread to the Levant and the Zagros Mountains, introducing the use of a fair amount of flint, and in 5000 BCE, they were pioneers of the Copper Age, or Chalcolithic, making copper pins and chisels through metallurgy. They had some houses that were bigger than the others and had partial ritualistic purposes, which are today called temples, implying a hierarchy ruled by priests. The period after 4000 BCE will see a large development of urban areas, including the city that gives the following period its name, Uruk, the birthplace of the Sumerian civilization. But that will be on the next episode. Fun fact, the Emperor of Mankind from the universe of Warhammer 40k is known to have been born between 8000 and 6000 BCE, as mentioned in the book The Master of Mankind. Now, he was also called a Hittite, but this culture did not rise until 2000 BCE, and the populations that would become the Hittites didn't come to Anatolia until 4400, implying that this is either a mistake or it just means that he took control of the Hittite Empire later on, which had an eagle with two heads, funnily enough. He would have been instead born to a head called Neolithic culture, maybe even like those of Göbekli Tepe, like my avatar. I would also like to point out how humanity needed a cataclysmic event, like the Younger Dryas, to focus mainly on farming and having a sedentary lifestyle. And then we needed another one, like the 8.2 kiloyear event, to realize that we needed containers to store the food and make it last longer. 300,000 years of human existence, and it's only in the last 5% that we make significant changes. And that shows you how incredibly important incentive is for things being done properly. That's it. Now you know that Jericho was humanity's first town in 9000 BCE. Çatalhöyük was the first city in 7000. The first pottery making cultures rised in 6400, and that the Copper Age started in 5000 BCE. Ciao!